back at the DevOps Talks conferences. How's it going today?
Yeah, really good.
Great.
Yeah, fantastic day today.
Would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure, my name's Dimitri. I'm a director at Message Media Group, and we're one of the sponsors at DevOps Talks this year.
Yes, and how's it been as a sponsor here at DevOps Talks?
It's been fantastic. It's the first one that I've spent a fair, decent time in amongst the developer community.
Okay.
And I think it's been great for our organisation to connect with that community and share insights into what we're doing in DevOps, but also share insights into our technology stack and how it can power certain outcomes.
That's very cool. I've noticed that your stand seems to always have people around it having conversations.
I don't know if it's because of the personnel or whether it's the headphones we're giving away.
It could be that too.
But we had a lot of great conversations, sharing again insights into what we're about and what we're doing and where we're going. And essentially how we can help the community power great outcomes with the technology stack, obviously.
Right, and one of your colleagues gave a talk earlier today as well.
Ben Mustafa, yeah. It's actually the first time I've heard Ben speak in such a forum. And I gave him the feedback before. I said, it's been great listening to you talk about our journey and the way we manage DevOps. So it was really good, really good.
Yeah.
Thoroughly enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it as well. Have you had the opportunity to listen to other talks while you've been here?
I've been in and out.
Okay.
So
Gotcha.
I'll be honest with you, I've been in and out. But
sure.
by all accounts, two of our team members spent a bit of time.
Okay.
And the feedback's been very positive from them. And also speaking to a lot of the developers as they came to our stand, all positive, which is great. And it obviously gives us confidence to reconnect again at the next event.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us at the DevOps Talks conference.
No, it's been a real pleasure.
All right.
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
All right, let's hit reboot on this thing. My name is Lindsay Holmwood. I'm an engineering manager over at Envato, one of the most successful Australian startups that you've probably never heard of. But today I am going to be talking about a DevOps approach to leading people. So I'm going to start today by telling you about one of the most difficult professional experiences that I've ever had in my career. Probably the most difficult professional experience that I've had. So back in 2015, I was working at a self-funded startup around applying machine learning to time series metrics. I got tapped on the shoulder by the incoming head of this small new government office called the DTO, the Digital Transformation Office, which was tasked with transforming the way that Australians, or the way that government delivers services to Australians, both from a delivery perspective, but also from a technology perspective. And I had some aspirations of maybe going into government at some point in the future, but I decided to take what I consider to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and pause the startup and go and join the government, go work in government. And I didn't really have a lot of idea about what exactly I was going to be walking into, but I thought, well, once in a lifetime opportunity, let's give it a shot. And so I turned up on my first day down in Canberra, and I discovered that I am possibly the only person in the entire organisation that has any idea about what software engineering is, let alone has done any sort of programming in their life. So that was a very interesting situation to find yourself in when you think that you're going into, do DevOps in government, and it's, oh, actually, this is like no technology at all. So like DevOps is aspirational at this point. And so very quickly I realized that I was in way over my head, and we really needed to ramp up hiring and really build a software engineering and delivery practice within the organization. And that comes through hiring people and setting up frameworks and giving people, some guidelines and letting them sort of solve the problems themselves. And so very quickly we ended up hiring about 50 people over the space of about 9 months. And they were working across about 6 different programs of work. For programs with as diverse sort of interests as sort of changing the way that we handle imports and export permits here in Australia at the borders, through to sort of building consolidated one pane of glass for understanding government information so that users didn't have to understand how government worked. It was just one website that you could go to and it would be able to help you find what you needed. Through to a national digital identity scheme, which is these days living over at Department of Human Services. And if anybody, actually quick show of hands, who here is familiar with the DTO or DTA in one form or another? Okay, so just a few people. So the people that are familiar with it are probably quite familiar with the turbulent and rocky journey that it has been on for the last 3 years. It was originally created under Malcolm Turnbull when he was Communications Minister, and very quickly it got moved up to Prime Minister and Cabinet when he became the Prime Minister about 3 years ago. There were a lot of problems inside. One interesting thing that I learnt was that a lot of people in government think that because they work for an organisation that has the word digital in the title, that they knew something about technology. Turns out that they don't. Funny that. And this ended up exacting an enormous personal toll on me. At the end of it, I ended up being diagnosed with reactive depression and PTSD. And it had an enormous toll on me, both personally, physically, but also on my family. And so after about 17, nearly 18 months of working there, I decided to quit because I just couldn't take that. I couldn't take the situation that I had been put in and the effect that it was having on me and my family. And the only reason that I didn't quit sooner was because I felt that I had an obligation to all the people that I had hired there. I'd hired nearly 50 people over the space of 9 months, and I'd brought them into this thing with a compelling vision for how we were going to change the way that Australia was how the government was going to be delivering services to all Australians. And I felt that I had an obligation to these people to protect them. And I basically spent the entire 18 months that I was there acting as the shit umbrella for everybody that was working in technology. And it turns out that my shit umbrella is pretty great at taking shit for about 18 months, but my breaking point is about 18 months. So that's a fun thing that I learned about myself. And at the end of it, when I ended up quitting, within 3 months, about 40 of the 50 people that I had hired had all left. So it's an 80% attrition rate in the space of 3 months, which is pretty wild when you think about it. And this goes to a problem that I've been struggling with my entire career around building great and resilient engineering teams. And I really learnt firsthand that, it doesn't really matter how great you are at building these teams. A bad system is going to beat a good person every time. So this sort of brought me back to this thing that I've been struggling with my entire career, which is what makes high-performing teams endure under varying and very difficult circumstances.
All right. And then that sort of leads to a more fundamental question, which is what actually is culture? We tend to talk about in DevOps that DevOps is sort of a combination of both the culture and the tools. But we sort of say culture is sort of this amorphous, not particularly well-defined thing. So I decided to go down a bit of an anthropological path to get a better understanding about what we actually are talking about when we're talking about culture. So there's this dude named Edgar Schein. He's a cultural anthropologist who's been working since the 1960s. He basically wrote the book, at least from a Western perspective, on what culture is. So Schein has this model of there being 3 different levels of culture. So the topmost level is artifacts, the mid-level is values, and the last is assumptions. And we have more artifacts and values and more values than assumptions. That culture that you have within organizations, it's not, culture doesn't just exist within organizations, it actually goes at multiple levels. So you have a national culture, an Australian culture, you've got an organizational culture, you also have a culture within individual teams, which can be quite different from the organizational culture. And then there's also occupational cultures, so things like people that do work in the ops space. We have the fact that you're all here today, you're part of a culture that is right here within this room. So let's sort of start at the beginning with the artifacts of culture, which there are the most of. So the artifacts that we have in culture are the physical manifestations of our culture. So they are things like the ceremonies that we run within our organisation, whether it's daily stand-ups, regular retros, grooming, planning, things like that. They're the org charts about the story that our organisations try and tell about the way that people are organised within those organisations. The desk layouts, whether you're living in one of these horror cube farms or a lovely, loud...
All right, so the desk layout that you might have inside your office, whether it's a horrid cube farm like this or a very lovely but terribly noisy open plan office, the documentation that we write, the processes and procedures for the way that we do things inside our organizations, and also the software that we write. The software is actually an artifact of our organizational culture. So the artifacts are the most visible parts of an organization's culture. They're also the easiest part of a culture to adapt. That's part of the reason why, from a DevOps perspective, there is so much focus on the tools, because the tools are the easy thing to be able to adopt and get going in your organization, right? Changing the broader culture around the values and the assumptions, that's the really, really hard bit, but tools are a nice sort of entry-level way of trying to adapt the way that the culture in your organization works and how we think about that. So then we go down to the next level of culture, which is the values. So the values are the conscious goals, strategies, and philosophies that we have and embrace within our organizations. They are the rules that guide how we interact with other people as well. And they guide how we do our actual work on a day-to-day basis. So you might have things like, we will dominate the market, or management is available and listens to all of our concerns, or we value quality over delivery speed, something like that. Maybe you have values like this, maybe you don't. Nobody will be fired for making an honest mistake, which is becoming more of a thing, particularly with DevOps culture becoming more widely adopted. And the thing to be really clear on with these values is that there are actually two different types of values. We've got lived values and the aspirational values. So the lived values are the ones that we actually do on a day-to-day basis, and then we have aspirational values as well, which is how we aspire to work as an organization. So you've probably seen values like this in your organization at some point, or some organization that you've worked at in the past. So, communication, we have an obligation to communicate. Respect, we treat each other as we would like to be treated. Integrity, we work with our customers and prospects openly, honestly, and sincerely. Excellence, we are satisfied with nothing less than the very best in everything that we do. And ethics, we conduct business affairs in accordance with all applicable laws in a moral and honest manner. So all this sounds like pretty legit, right? Like you probably worked in organizations that have had values like this. Well, these were also the values of Enron. These are literally the ones that are up on the plaques in the front foyer when you used to walk into Enron. So you can see there that there is a little bit of a gulf between the lived values of the organization and the aspirational values which they've got up on the wall. And this is really about sort of understanding the way the gap and the gulf between how we imagine that work is done within our organization and how it is actually done within our organization. And it's really clear with our values to be to say whether these aspirational or lived values, right? So people have got a pretty fine-tuned nose for bullshit. So then we get down to the lower level of Shine's model, which is assumptions. So assumptions are the beliefs, perceptions, and thoughts and feelings about what work is like and what our workplaces are like. These often exist at a very unconscious level, so they're not something that you can necessarily put your finger on, something that it takes time to work out in an organization what these assumptions actually are. And even if you do work out what they are, you sort of know it subconsciously. You can't quite put your finger on what it is, and it's difficult to sort of articulate what it is. And these are very, very hard to discern, particularly for new people when you come in to a particular organization, particularly if the assumptions are actually conflicting with the values of the organization. So assumptions might be something like, anyone is actually permitted to take on a leadership responsibility in an org. Bad outcomes come from bad people. Perhaps you've lived in organizations that have this sort of fundamental assumption at their core. Or maybe it's okay to withhold information from some people, but not others. Maybe individual performance is valued over team performance, which might be different to, say, the stated values of the organization. Or maybe it's something a bit nicer, which is like we can actually trust that team, right? It's not something that's encoded in the values, it's just as an assumption through like the way that we do work on a day-to-day basis. And often you can end up, once you sort of discover what these assumptions are, it can make you feel a little bit like this. All right, so the thing about culture, though, is that fundamentally it's determined by our people, the people that we have in our organizations. And I'm a very firm believer that if we can change our people, we can influence our culture. And, this isn't just my belief, it's actually backed up by anthropological evidence. And Graham Henry, the former coach of the All Blacks, had this really great quote, which is that better people make better All Blacks. So if we can make our people better, we can make our organizations, our teams perform better overall. So what makes a good team member then within our organizations? So trust is a very fundamental sort of building block here. So when I'm talking about trust, I'm talking about vulnerability. I'm talking about openness about what's working and what isn't, and being willing to sort of, put the first step forward and actually saying what you're doing wrong. Not necessarily what other people are doing wrong, but, being I guess being measured about like how you are actually performing and working in an organization. Trust is also about assuming the best of others that you're working with, right? And trust is also really important to be aware of your cognitive biases when you're interacting and working with other people. So not just the cognitive biases in other people, which are very, very easy to spot, but then the cognitive biases that we ourselves have, which are a lot easier for other people to spot than ourselves. And being receptive to that feedback and being willing to be vulnerable about maybe actually I think that I'm doing okay, but perhaps I'm not. And so one of the really sort of core cognitive biases there, which is really, really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about trust, is a thing called the fundamental attribution error. So with the FAE, we judge others by their actions and we judge ourselves by our intentions. And by that I mean, like, say that you're driving down on the freeway and all of a sudden somebody in a lane next to you swerves out and you go, oh wow, that guy's a total dickhead for driving like that. Where did he get his driver's license in the bottom of a cereal box? But what we don't actually understand is that particular person may have been swerving out of the way to avoid a kangaroo, right? So the intention of that person is, I don't want to do any harm to an animal, whereas we're evaluating their behavior based on the action, the thing that what we could observe, not the actual intention of the person. Another cognitive bias that plays into this as well is a thing called the hindsight bias. So the hindsight bias is also sort of more popularly known as like the knew it all along effect or creeping determinism. So the hindsight bias is actually a form of memory distortion that we all partake in when it comes to evaluating our behavior and experiences during particular events. So what we actually end up doing is we say that new information that we receive after the event, so knowing the outcome of a particular event, actually influences how we remember that particular event, which is sort of problematic because it means that we are all unreliable witnesses in our own stories. And the distortion that we engage in, and it's not conscious of course, is a distortion that favours the actor, so it favours ourselves in these bad situations. And often it's a distortion used to form a particular judgment that you were responsible for this failure, not me, because you were neglectful, inattentive and derelict of duty, right? We're judging other people by their actions, not by their actual intentions. And we often use this as a way to attribute failure to a person and not a system, right? And you've probably all been in situations in your professional career where you've experienced this, either through being on the receiving end or maybe doling it out to other people. I know I certainly have. And this is a cognitive bias that is very easy to pick up in other people, but not so easy to be able to identify in ourselves. And that's why being part of a team is so important to growing individually as a person. And being the more negative of an outcome is actually result of it results in a stronger version of that bias. So if the outcome is particularly bad, we're actually going to engage in the hindsight bias a hell of a lot more strongly. And we see this, this is a really common narrative that we have within our culture. So within literally days of the MH17 air disaster, we saw newspaper articles with titles like this, the tragedy reveals a need for the flight path overhaul because they took an abandoned flight path and they could have avoided Ukrainian airspace from $66 per passenger. Why were they over a conflict zone in the first place? Never mind that there were plenty of other planes flying over that conflict zone at the same day. And these aren't fringe opinions. This is not fake news or any of that bullshit. These are all article titles from articles that are coming from newspaper sources that we know and trust. Maybe not the Daily Mail though. Hindsight bias fundamentally is your culture killer. It's the thing that taints all interactions with other people in your organization. So being aware of it when you're possibly engaging in it is really, really important, but also being able to call out other people and having the vulnerability yourself to be called out on that and actually react and respond to that and to change your behavior appropriately. And the reason that this is so important is trust is one of those things that's really, really hard to build and incredibly easy to lose. In fact, there's actually a little bit of a ratio that's at the sort of the simplest version is a 5-to-1. It actually changes. That top number can be upwards of 7 or 9-to-1. So the 5-to-1 ratio is that for every one bad thing that you do to somebody else, you need to do at least 5 meaningful things to be able to make up for it. So it's a good thing it's a good ratio to keep in mind, both in your professional lives, but also in your personal lives as well. And that's where that number actually changes. So generally, the more intimately you know the other person, the harder you have to work at rebuilding their trust when you do something bad. So 5 to 1 is an absolute base, as a baseline there. The other thing for building, trust with people is having regular one-on-ones. Like if you're, quick show of hands, who here is in like a management or leadership position within their organization? Okay, so maybe like a third, maybe half the room. That's pretty cool. And the reason that one-on-ones are really, really important is that you're there as a leader to be able to create a space for people in your teams to vent. And not just vent, but also complain. So vent is like, saying, well, I'm having a really shit time and I want to get something off my chest. Whereas complaints is more focused, more targeted. It's like, okay, what's the next step that we can do here to actually make this better? And one-on-ones are like the prime place for being able to have these conversations with your people and you being able to have those conversations with your boss as well. Quick show of hands, who does regular one-on-ones in one form or another? Okay, so most people. So for the people who didn't put their hands up, your take-home task at the end of the day is to go and make sure that you have a regular one-on-one scheduled in with your boss. It will change your relationship. It is quite transformative. And for these to work effectively, they have to be regular and they have to go for a minimum of half an hour. So whether that's once a week or once a fortnight, once a month is probably a little bit too infrequent, because if you end up missing one and you do that 6 times a year, it means you only end up having 6 one-on-ones a year. That's sort of problematic. But having these regular, predictable points where you're able to provide feedback both up and down the chain is really, really important for maintaining good trust with the people that you work with. And if you're in a leadership position, it's also really important that you take a genuine interest. You can't feign interest. People will spot that a mile away and they will call you out, and at that point you may as well just cancel the whole one-on-one. It's not going to work for you at all. One other interesting point here as well is that if you do these within your organization, performance reviews, like annual performance reviews, I'm assuming most organizations, most of the organizations that people work for here are doing these, you should aim to eliminate these. So, if you're in HR for some reason, then this is probably one of the most important things you can do to change the culture in your organization. There are tons of studies that show that there's an enormous body of evidence that shows that eliminating regular annual performance reviews, and particularly performance reviews that are tied to remuneration, significantly reduce the amount of stress and anxiety of people in those organizations. So this is one of the simplest things that you can do. And if you've got control within your organization to stop doing that, you should absolutely do everything you can to make sure that that happens. All right. So what about other things that you're looking for in people to have great team members? So one of the other things you're looking for is the ability for people to be able to thrive in conflict. And when I'm talking about conflict, I'm talking about conflict around ideas, not interpersonal conflict, so conflict around personality. And you're looking for people that are able to discern between the two. The conflict around ideas is very productive. The conflict around personality, not so great. Because again, when you take into account things like the fundamental attribution error and hindsight bias, you end up engaging in both of those hindsight bias subconsciously when you're engaging in conflict with other people, and that's sort of problematic. So you're looking for people that are able to be able to discern between the two, and ideally you're looking for people that can have strong opinions that are loosely held, so they can change and update their priors based on new information that they learn. The last thing that we're looking for here in our people is the ability to be able to commit and act, and this is a really, really difficult one. This is something you can actually start practicing today in your organizations. So it's really important to understand that when it comes to decision making within teams, you don't need consensus from everybody that is within that team. What you do need is commitment, right? So consensus is often sort of a bit fake in a lot of organizations. So you have a bunch of people sort of sitting around at the meeting saying, yeah, okay, we totally agree to do this thing, and they go back to their offices and they're like, fuck that, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. So, and that's something that as Australians we totally engage in as well, very, very passive aggressively. So, you're not looking for consensus. You don't have to get everybody to agree on that, but you do have to get commitment that on what the actual path forward is and how we're actually going to do it. So you have to find people that are willing to put their personal opinions aside, and it's possible to learn this sort of behavior as well. It just takes a long time. And the thing about this is that, you don't have to have people that actively sabotage as well. Disagreement is totally okay. The point, though, that you want to get to at the end of whenever you're making a decision is you want people to be able to say, I don't agree with the decision, but I'm going to do everything that I can do to see it succeed. And I find myself doing this fairly regularly, like particularly when you have to work with other people that are perhaps not from non-technical disciplines who have a different worldview of yours. And this is a phrase that I find myself saying at least once a week, and not just saying it, but also believing and acting on it as well, because it's very possible that I'm completely wrong in these situations, and I want to prove, I want to sort of invalidate that particular hypothesis. And the last thing that we're looking for here in people is people that are able to understand their relationships with work. So the question that I've got for you is, are you an integrator or a segmenter? Well, to be able to answer that question, you probably need to know what both of these things are. So segmenters create partitions between their work life and their home life. They use rituals to reinforce boundaries between the two. So whether that's wearing shoes while working. I work from home. I've been working in distributed teams for most of the last decade. One of the rituals that I have every day is these clothes that you see me in right now are actually my work clothes, and I have a signaling sort of a priming of myself where I put on shoes at the beginning of the day, and when I'm not working, I take the shoes off. So I'm establishing a ritual there to be able to segment between my home life and my work life. Maybe you have different devices. Sometimes this is required from a security perspective. I can also highly recommend it just from a personal mental health perspective. It's good to have different devices. One of the other fun ones that I've seen is like if people are working from home, like walking around the block as well. So I worked with somebody in the past where they lived on a city block, and at the beginning of every day, they would come down from their apartment, they would walk around the block clockwise, and they would go back up and they would do their work. And then at the end of the day, they would come out of the building and walk around the block counterclockwise. So that's a very simple ritual that you can have to be able to reinforce the sort of segmentation of the home life and work life. Standing desks are also pretty great for this as well, because if you get to the end of a day or a point in the day and you are unable to stand anymore to work, maybe you shouldn't fucking be working anymore. Crazy idea. And then on the other hand, we have integrators. So integrators are people who blend their home and work life together. And this is really, really easy to do when you're working from home in particular. So integrators have a strong desire to blur the two domains. They can sort of relatively easily switch between the two different domains at any point. Integrators also easily transition between these domains, and they actively work on doing this and sort of merging those two different domains together. And the thing about understanding your relationship with work, whether you're an integrator or a segmenter, is that this changes over time. So the thing that I've sort of learned is that I'm naturally an integrator. So I sort of started my work journey and my professional career as an integrator, and I've realized that while that makes me feel good about what I'm doing, it's also terrible in the long term. So I'm essentially an integrator in a segmenter's clothing. And so your relationship with work will change over time as well, based on what your responsibilities are, the way that your team works, your responsibilities to those teams. Another interesting point as well is that integrators are more accepting of segmenters than vice versa. So a really interesting study around this was looking at the acceptance rate of people, so opening up like childcare in the workplace, and looking at the acceptance of that from people who identify as integrators or identify it as segmenters. So it turns out the segmenters really, really hate having childcare opened up in offices, because it directly conflicts with their views about the separation of the home life and the work life. You're actually bringing children into the workspace, and that really riles people up, turns out. But the fun thing about that is that integrators are just more accepting of segmenters as well. So while segmenters tend to be pretty rigid in their beliefs about their relationship with work, integrators are much more accepting of the segmenters. Another interesting point here, though, is the integrators need boundaries too, and strategies for disconnecting. And there's some pretty good reasons for that, because segmenters actually report high levels of job satisfaction and lower levels of burnout compared to integrators, which is sort of interesting. So why is all of this important? Well, because integration is actually a very slippery slope to burnout. I'm assuming that I'm not going to even bother asking people to raise their hand, because I'm assuming that pretty much every single person in this room has experienced burnout at one point in their life. And so the sort of authoritative source on this is this lady named Christina Maslach. She is a organizational psychologist. She basically wrote the book on our understanding of what burnout actually is. And so when we talk about burnout is it's sort of like culture. It's a relatively ambiguous and amorphous term, but it's actually made up of 6 different contributing factors. So the first is workload, then we have control, reward, community, fairness, and values. And she's written a really great book on this. I'll provide sources at the end and you can go have a look at that. It's a pretty short read, but it's a really great way of understanding your relationship to work and some really practical tools that you can start using every day for measuring that relationship to work over time. And the reason that I mention all this is that you often as an integrator end up being in the situation where you end up just taking too much on, right? Because you don't have those rigid boundaries between the home life and the work life. And because you don't have those boundaries, you just take more and more on. And this is the number one place that people get burnt out, particularly if you're an integrator. Okay, so understanding your relationship with work is really, really important. It's something that you can start doing today as well. And if you're in a leadership position, I firmly believe that it's your obligation to start promoting a culture of segmentation. All right, so what makes a good team then? We've focused on the better people side of things. Let's talk about the better all black side of things. So the starting point here is diversity and inclusion. And when I'm talking about diversity, I'm talking about race, gender, sexual orientation, age, the socio-economic status, as well as location, disability, experience, the work hours that people are able to do. This is particularly problematic for women who leave technology when they're having children and they don't come back because they're unable to have a workplace that is adapting to their home needs. And it's not something that should be restricted just to women as well. It's also a problem for men who also take paid parental leave. And the way that you achieve this particular diversity within your organization is by seeking out these diverse candidates. So they're not just going to come to you. You can put stuff on your position descriptions and your job descriptions actively calling out that you're looking for people from diverse backgrounds. But unless you actually go to where these people are, and that often means leveraging existing networks of people that you've got, it's going to be very, very difficult to get these people to come and work for you. But the thing about diversity is that it's all for naught unless if you don't include and adapt and embrace those differences from those people as part of your actual culture. And that's a really, really tough thing to deal with. That means changing the way that the way that we do things here, listening to new and dissenting voices. And it also means that there are going to be uncomfortable conversations when you have these culture clashes. And that's a good thing because you're getting to the heart of the problem. You're actually able to resolve it and make a more adaptive and diverse culture and inclusive culture for everybody that is there. And to do that effectively, you have to create these safe mechanisms for people to be able to raise criticism as well. So when I'm talking about safe, I'm talking about voluntary and non-punitive ways of being able to report problems. And if you're in a leadership position, it means that you have to actually act on that criticism as well, right? It's not just enough to hear it and sort of pay lip service to it. You actually have to do something about it. And that's really where the rubber hits the road. All right, one of the other things that we're looking for in our teams as well is leadership in the absence of leadership. And that sounds sort of weird. What do I actually mean by that? So I'm a very firm believer that having a title isn't a requirement for leadership. So you don't have to have the team lead title or delivery lead title to be able to be a leader inside your organization. The real measure of a team is if the lead of the team, the nominal person that's on the org chart that is leading that team, steps away from that team, the team functions effectively for an extended period of time. And by extended period of time, I'm not talking like 2 days. I'm talking like weeks, months even. It's your responsibility as a leader to build up that leadership capability within the team and the ability to self-steer and self-organize so that if you do step away, that the team is able to function effectively without you. Surprises that you have through doing this are indicators of team misalignment. So a really great way to sort of think about testing the anti-fragility of your leadership capability in your team is when people go on leave. So when they go on sick leave or they're on holidays or they're on paid parental leave, the surprises that you discover as part of that are things that you need to be listening to and paying a lot of attention to work out where are the areas that we're falling short on and what do we need to actually improve on. I used to be, at the very beginning, before I was in management, I used to think that, people can just look out for themselves, it'll be fine. And then I sort of took on this whole idea of, the way that I'm effective for my team is that I am the team's shit umbrella. And then I sort of had this galaxy brain moment of, why doesn't everybody have their own shit umbrella? And that's sort of what you should be optimizing for as a team lead. Of course, referring back to the thing that Deming said earlier, bad system is going to beat good person every single time. So even if you do give everybody their own shit umbrella, the question is how long that shit umbrella is going to be effective for. And if this is working correctly, you want the team to be able to foster conflict around ideas themselves. You shouldn't be there to agitate. There are people within the team that are able to actively do that, and ideally everybody in the team is actively doing that. The team also should have the authority and the autonomy to both remove blockers themselves and make sort of strategic critical decisions without blocking and relying on other people within the organization. And that is a really interesting position to be in from a team leader's perspective, because it means that you can start influencing and observing trends and behavior across the organization and incorporating that and delivering better context to the team, right? Because you're not focused downward so much, you're focused more up and out. And the way that I sort of think about leadership is that it's a bit like a bird that you're holding in your hands, right? If you hold it too tight, you're going to crush the bird. If you hold it too loose, the bird's going to fly away. It's a good way to think about leadership. And the thing that team leaders can now do is they can focus on building better relationships with non-technical contributors and non-technical stakeholders within our organization, which is really about expanding the scope of what we're trying to do in DevOps, right? To be beyond just the dev and the ops side of things. It's about the entire organization and organizational optimization there. And not only can we then build better relationships, but also integrate those non-technical contributions into the ways of working on a day-to-day basis. So the other thing that we're really looking for, this is the aspirational point for really sort of doing leadership with the DevOps perspective, is that non-technical contributions have to be on an equal footing inside your teams. And I'm not talking about just documentation and keeping tickets up to date and organizing events and all those sort of things that we think of when we think of non-technical activities. We're talking much, much, much broader than that. So does anybody know who this dude is? Quick shout out. All right, well, you're in for a treat. This dude is named Melvin Conway, and he came up with this thing called the Conway's Law, which is that organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. So quick show of hands, who here is not familiar with Conway's Law? Okay, great. Everybody's familiar, or not, okay, well, except for that one person there. You're about to get a sort of a quick primer on that as well, so congrats. So yeah, you may not know the face, but you definitely know Conway's Law. And Conway's Law is actually sort of an anthropological observation. It's more of an adage rather than a law into this thing called mirroring. So mirroring is actually this thing that's been studied in organizational design and organizations as complex systems as well as product design over the last nearly 60 years, which is sort of interesting, and we have absolutely no knowledge of it whatsoever within the technology space, which is sort of cool because it means that there's lots of great research that we can draw on and actually do building teams and building products and sustaining teams and sustaining products better. So the mirroring hypothesis is this idea that in a complex system, the technical architecture and the division of labor will mirror one another in the sense that the network structure of one will correspond to the structure of another. There's a really great paper that was published by Colfer and Baldwin back in 2016 as a really great overview of about 60 years worth of research into the mirroring hypothesis. So there are two separate traditions into studying mirroring over the last 60 years. The first is one in computer science, which is Conway's Law. There was a bit of research that was done into this from the 60s through to the early 80s. But then it sort of went dead until open source really sort of revived the research into this, starting at the tail end of the 90s. But in that sort of dead period, that's where things were really lighting up in the management space, where all the research here was happening around org and product design and orgs and products as complex systems. So what is mirroring? Like I've mentioned it a couple of times. Let's actually break it down. So mirroring is the idea that inside your organization, there are two separate networks. One is organizational, so how we arrange and organize people. The second is technical, the way all of our technical systems are actually connected to one another. And so mirroring is the degree to which the organizational structure mirrors the technical structure. So in this particular case, if we overlay the two on top of one another, we would say that this is a strongly mirrored system. There are different reasons why this is good and bad. It's all about trade-offs, like anything in technology or just the world in general. And why do we do this? Well, we do this to solve problems. It turns out that it's a very effective way of being able to solve problems because we end up taking people to where the problems actually are. People are co-located with the systems that they are fundamentally responsible for. And not just like technical systems when we think about like technology and software engineering and things like that, but it also applies to things like, manufacturing, aviation, healthcare, all these different other industries where this is where all this really interesting research has happened. And it really helps us solve this problem of like, okay, we have a bunch of different systems, or maybe there's one system and a bunch of teams that might be responsible for. It helps us sort of cut to the chase of like who actually owns the system. So name the team after the system, like SEO for teams, I guess. And we do this because it's economical. It's a very, very cheap way of being able to organize people and technology within our organizations. So there's this really interesting paper from Galbraith in 1974, which is sort of foundational to understanding the way that organizations process information. Now, why am I mentioning this? Well, it turns out that it has a really strong link with DevOps. It was actually talking about DevOps before DevOps was even a thing. So in this particular paper, Galbraith puts forth that as uncertainty increases, the amount of information that must be processed by decision makers increases. And an organization can respond to this by either reducing the need to process information or by increasing the capacity to process information. So to do that, there's to reduce the need for processing information, you can either create Slack resources or create more self-contained tasks, right? So that the work can be done more individually and atomically with less coordination overhead, or just having more Slack to be able to pick up weird and wonderful things that come through. The second part, though, is increasing the capacity to process information, so investment in vertical information systems, so lines of business, as we would probably think about them today, and the creation of lateral relations. That sounds sort of DevOpsy, doesn't it? And so all of this is governed by rules and programs, hierarchical referral, and goal setting. But what Galbraith is talking about here back in 1974, he basically hit the nail on the head about what DevOps actually is. A good 25 years before we even really coined the term, which is sort of amazing. So when we're talking about the creation of lateral relations, Galbraith makes reference to these 7 different ways that we can do that in our organization. So direct one-to-one contact between people in liaison roles, task forces, teams, integrating roles, managerial linking roles, and matrix organizations. And so, you're probably familiar with this, like a matrix organization. In fact, as far as I'm aware, this is probably one of the first references in academic literature about the way that matrix organizations work. And so you can see here that we've got like product management, engineering, manufacturing, and marketing all together. But if we're going to update this for like 2018, it probably looks something a bit like this, right? You've got your dev, your ops, and your design, and with your product people that are sitting over there, right? So you've got these communities of practice, like Nathan was talking about earlier, that are organizing a particular discipline or an occupational culture, referring back to what Shine was talking about, that are lending their capabilities and capacities over to product management to actually deliver services that meet users' needs. So the question that I've got for all of you today is, why do we stop at dev and ops? Maybe because it's just named that, and so we've decided that, well, the context is bounded to the name. But we can also go about including support, marketing, design, analytics, legal, and finance. And in fact, we should be doing that if we're serious about delivering value for our customers. So then the inevitable question is, what happens if we don't do this? So there's this really fantastic paper by Henderson and Clark in 1990 around architectural innovation. And so this is a 3-year study of the semiconductor photolithographic alignment equipment industry. Does anybody know what a photolithographic alignment equipment does? Okay, cool. So basically it's a thing that lives inside your camera, and it's a way for taking pictures. Like, that's a massive simplification. It's way more complicated than that. But this particular study was a field-based study studying a high rate of change industry. So they looked at both, they did like in-person interviews at all these different companies, and they also looked at stock market performance, things like that. But it's a huge amount of research here. They actually, the basis of it was covering a 25-year period. It's a very, very long-running study. So in this particular industry, the photolithographic alignment technology, the industry experienced 4 different waves of innovation between 1962 and 1986. So the first was around proximity alignment, to scanning projection, to first-generation stepper, and then to the second-generation stepper, all the way down here. And so that fundamentally changed the way that this technology actually worked. And the interesting thing about these 4 waves of innovation was that after each wave of innovation, there was a new leader in the industry every single time, which is sort of wild when you think about it. And each incumbent was unable to course correct to be able to maintain its position within the industry, even though each incumbent invested super heavily in that new technology, which is sort of crazy when you think about it. You know, these companies have usurped the dominant leader in the market, and they've come up and they're dominating the market at that point, and they are unable to stop themselves from being usurped by other players in the market, even though they're heavily investing in this. And the reason behind this is because each incumbent structured the organization and communication based on the product architecture alone. Right? Not the other relationships within the organization of people that are working in support or legal or finance. They focus purely on the technical product architecture, and that's the way that they organize people. So what about that makes sense? So Henderson and Clark have this really interesting model based on Schumpeter from 42. And so the idea here is that in an organization, when a new product is being created, an organization is engaging in this radical innovation down here. Once they establish the product, they go into modular innovation, and then the product sort of oscillates here between modular innovation and incremental innovation. Until eventually, when the product and the organization is under threat, they try and evolve into this architectural innovation all the way over here. Right. But the problem is that when they're engaging in this architectural innovation, they're not changing the way that the organization itself is actually structured. So we're talking about at the beginning here having a very strongly mirrored system when an organization is engaging in this modular and incremental innovation. And then when we fundamentally changing the architecture and doing radical innovation or architectural innovation here, we're not updating the organization structure, and there's a broken mirror. And so the TLDR for this is that you should mirror in these particular cases and don't mirror in another. I've got another talk I can point you to if you're interested in this in more detail. So then that sort of goes to the final question here today, which is how do we as leaders build resilient organizations? How do we sort of cobble all this information together and sort of have a single sort of mental model for the way that we can view this? So if we go back to Shine's model of artifacts, values, and assumptions, we can think of our systems and our technology as artifacts, and our processes are also artifacts of our culture, right? The thing that we know about that is the artifacts influence the values and the values influence the artifacts. Likewise, the values also influence the assumptions, right? So tools are our snapshot of our organization's culture at a particular point, right? Which means that they're a snapshot of our org's values and assumptions, right? We know that artifacts influence behavior, right? So if you come to work every day and your pass doesn't work when you're trying to get into the building, you're going to be feeling pretty shitty by the time you get up to your desk, right? So the artifact of the organization, the dodgy door passes, is actually influencing our behavior towards other people in our organization. So we can go about this and we can hack this from a DevOps perspective by encoding the organization behavior that we want to see in our own artifacts. So we can change the organization's values by changing the artifacts themselves. And by that I mean, let's say we put all changes that go through a CD pipeline. That's an organizational artifact. By doing that, we're reinforcing this value that we create fast feedback loops to learn from changes in production. Maybe we are saying that developers and managers do on call. That's sort of cool. That's an artifact, which is reinforcing this value of performance, availability, and sustainability are everyone's responsibility, not just dev or ops' responsibility. Everybody up and down the management chain has got that responsibility. Another artifact that we might have is that our ceremonies include and engage non-technical disciplines, right? And the value that's reinforcing there is nobody has all the answers. We succeed by actually working together, being inclusive, and bringing non-technical contributors into the decision-making and the operation process. And the thing to remember here is that the tools are only a means to an end in your organization. The goal is transforming your ways of working on a day-to-day basis. And I would posit that it's not a question of whether we actually must include support, marketing, design, analytics, legal, and finance, and all the other disciplines within our organizations as part of the decision-making process on our products. Patrick Lencioni said it best. He said, if you could get all the people in an organization rowing in the same direction, you could dominate any industry in any market against any competition at any time. I'm Lindsay. Thank you very much.